Hello, good morning, or good afternoon now, I suppose. My name is Rebecca Ormond and I work at PwC, where I've been for the last 16 years. I went there as a temp. I thought this would be 2 weeks where I'd do various things for them, and I'm still there 16 years later. And one of the reasons for that is that they have kept finding interesting new things for me to work on. And for the last, I suppose, about 5 years, I've been focused on culture, and most recently the work that we do around inclusion and around well-being. Because for me, I think if I look at the challenges that we have in the workplace, not just for us at PwC, but also in organisational culture more generally, if we can really crack the behaviours that you need to build an inclusive culture and create an environment where people feel they can have healthy, balanced lives, I think you really make a difference to culture overall. So I'm going to talk today about some of the things that are there in the private sector more broadly, and some of the things that we talk about with our clients, but also about what we ourselves do around gender balance and inclusion. So as Jackie mentioned, the theme for 2019 is balance for better, but why? Why do we need balance? There is the point that it's the right thing to do. I think those of us who come into this kind of work from a social justice angle want to see fairer, more balanced societies, and balance between women and men in those societies is one of the critical aspects of that. But the other thing is, we know it's a really, really significant issue for business. It's not just a women's issue, it's not even just a people issue, it's a fundamentally commercial issue. Because there's a lot of research now around, and we know that businesses which are diverse and inclusive actually perform better in many, many ways. So they create better outcomes for customers is the first thing, because usually, very rarely, your customers are all one type of person. There's a really great story about the first health app created by Apple, where they critically left out the menstruation tracker, because all of the team were men. And actually, period tracking was probably one of the most successful areas of app sales at the time. And there was a pretty big gap in that. It was quite quickly redone, and that was included. But it's a really classic example of how, if you don't have diversity in the teams that create things for customers, you may miss out some of your target market. But also they drive better business returns overall. So there's an ongoing research in this area, but growing evidence indicates that diverse boards are better governed and actually economically more successful. It's one of those interesting things in that it's partly about the diversity, but it's also partly about the culture that exists there. When you create a culture which allows everyone to rise to the top, regardless of their background, their gender, their ethnicity, it also creates an environment where there's space to disagree, where there's space to have open discussion. And the behaviours that drive that are the ones that I believe drive better performance overall. We know that diverse teams are more innovative. It's really easy for teams to look inward only, and the more diversity there is in a team, the more that you're able to take into account different viewpoints, different lenses on the world, the more innovative that the solutions and ideas that those teams come up with. And it's really significant in terms of attracting employees. In very simple terms, women, I think, currently represent about 51% of the workforce. So why would you not make your organisation attractive to 51% of your talent market? So it's really important in that vein, but it's also really important at a more nuanced level around, particularly today, more and more people say that it's one of the things that they look for when they are looking at organisations to work for, is how inclusive and how diverse are those organisations themselves, regardless of whether they are men or women. And lastly, it's increasingly a reputational issue. There are very few things that are more important to organisations than their brand. And increasingly we're seeing that lack of diversity, and I'm sure some of you see this in the press because it's something that comes up quite frequently now, lack of diversity is an increasingly reputational issue. So taking really positive steps to address equality in the workplace is now something that is firmly on the agenda. So how do we do it? Well, one of the things that I think is really important is to really see diversity and inclusion as strategic business priorities. So first and foremost, treat it as a business imperative, because it really is. and then understand the potential for diversity and inclusion to significantly impact your reputation. Leadership has to reflect the makeup of both its employees and customers. So one of the areas that we focus on a lot is the diversity of leadership teams. And it's really important that we use the requirements that are coming through around reporting to be really open and transparent around things like that make things visible, like ethnicity and gender pay reporting. So what does that actually look like when you put it into action? Well, the first thing is that actually it's really important to make it a business-led idea. So why does diversity matter to, for example, things like your customer satisfaction, things like your ability to attract new employees? The second piece is around the accountability and the leadership and the tone from the top. I'm very lucky at PwC in that when I hear our leaders talk about this, they talk about it authentically. It is not something that they're paying lip service to. And if you ask them more questions, you don't find that they suddenly unravel at question 3, because actually they do believe in it. And that authenticity and that tone for the top is incredibly powerful and makes an enormous difference to your ability to affect change. Then, like lots of things, it's massively improved by objectives and action plans, because what is it that you're trying to do? How will you measure it and how will you go about it? Inclusion isn't a project, but there are lots of things about it where having that approach enables you to make change faster. And then increasingly we are able to use data to hold people accountable to this. One of the things I'll talk about a little bit is some of the challenges around data and the way that our systems are built. But actually, as I work in this area today, we are more and more able to understand who's joining our organisation, how do they progress through our organisation, how do we reward people, how do we recognise the contribution that they make, and to look at that from both a gender and an ethnicity perspective. And that kind of data is really powerful, because one of the things that I find myself doing quite a lot is myth busting and saying, well, you might feel it's like that, but let's talk about what really happens here, and to use data in that way. And then the last piece is to really, we say tell it how it is. It's to be brave to have the honest conversation. And some of those conversations are really tricky. It's not always a comfortable discussion to talk about where we really believe we could do better. But if you're not willing to be open and honest about these things, it's really, really hard to change them. So what has changed in recent years? The good news is things are getting better. And they're not just in our organisation, but more broadly. So we run something at PwC called the CEO Survey, and we talk to CEOs every year. And one of the things that came up is that if you go back as far as 2011, actually CEOs were not terribly concerned about female talent. And they didn't have plans to change things in order to address that. But even as quickly as moving towards to 2015, suddenly you went from it being on the agenda of very few to 64% of CEOs confirming that actually they really had a plan, and 13% saying that actually they needed a plan. So it's really moving up in people's minds, and that's happening quite quickly. And then today, actually, we have published this year's Women in Work Index. So this is data that was released this morning. And in 2011, the UK was in 17th place on the in demonstrating its place on the index. But actually, we are now in 13th position. So the UK is moving slowly forward. But it is moving forward, and for the UK in particular, what drives us not moving further forward actually is the UK gender pay gap. But at the same time, we're still seeing, and this is one of the factors that drives gender pay, we're still seeing poorer representation of women at senior levels. And one of the things that came out in this year's Windex was that women still only account for 1 in 5 of the seats on the board in publicly listed OECD country companies. So that data is improving all the time, but that data is also really, really helpful when we're having conversations about, well, this is where we were and this is where we want to get to. The challenge around that is that I think lots of us feel that what can we do to get there faster? because the World Economic Forum published last year that actually it will take 202 years to close the gender pay gap globally. And that's, I think if we're a woman, that's a really depressing statistic. And over 60 years in Western Europe just to achieve gender parity. And that's in Western Europe. If you go to East Asia and the Pacific, actually it's 170 years. Which for me is something that I find really, really disappointing. So the question that we're asking as an organisation is how can we get there faster? And businesses play a really critical role in that. Because one of the things that they do that happens is, what do they do with legislation? What do they do with things that come out of government and to really bring those to life? Gender pay gap reporting is one of those. The UK gender pay gap is 17.9%. And it'll be really interesting to see what happens this year, because it's March this year that all companies with over 250 employees had to have reported by. So we've sort of got to the end of the first full year, but we've got a proper year next year. Shared parental leave is beginning to make a little bit of a difference. It's a really critical sort of structural underpinner. In PwC, we have a number of people who have taken shared parental leave and who have really talked about actually the difference that has made for them and the positive impact that it has had on their life. But it's a critical enabler of changing things. There's a lot of work at the moment in relation to the Women in Finance Charter, and the Hampton-Alexander Review is a review sponsored by government that is focused on women in leadership positions. The extent to which organisations such as ours take those things on board and try and run with them and try and say, how does this look in our organisation, can be a really, really powerful thing for helping to drive change. So businesses play a really critical role in helping to shift the dial and do that really visibly. But what holds up process? Well, for me, I think the thing that's holding up progress the most is the lack of consistency. I'm very lucky to work for an organisation that does take this seriously, but it's not consistent across, particularly the private sector, and people have differing views. The other thing that's quite tricky is actually where people's data is. We're very lucky. Our gender, the extent to which we have good data on gender is around. We've got about 98% disclosure. And around ethnicity, we have 92% disclosure. But what we do know is we're in the minority of having that level of disclosure. Once you know who your people are, and we've got over 20,000 people in the UK, it's really easy to look at what's happening. When you don't know, it's really difficult to understand what's really going on. But as systems change and grow, there's real opportunity for people to improve that. And that's where regulation's really helpful. When you have something like gender pay reporting coming in, it forces people to look at, well, we need accurate data in order to be able to do that. So how are we going to get that data? The other thing that really slows things down is around lack of accountability and measurement frameworks. When I talk to people working in this space, it's really interesting to understand how many of them aren't clear about what it is that they're trying to achieve and who owns the results for that, which means that efforts end up being patchy. And if I'm really honest, the thing that probably is the most disappointing is that too few organisations really genuinely believe this is a business critical issue. There are more and more all the time, but there are still lots that don't. And the other thing is it's hard. A lot of what the challenges we face are around unconscious bias. So when you're talking to someone about their experience, quite often they will say, but it doesn't feel like that. So a lot of the work that I do is around behavioural change and asking people what they need to do differently and could they see it from a different perspective. And actually maybe their perspective isn't reality. And sometimes those conversations are really difficult and they take a bit of time. So work on gender balance is not easy. Just like all work on inclusion is not easy, but it doesn't mean it's not worth doing. So I think the other thing that's really worth highlighting is that progress is really patchy. If I reflect back to when I was coming into the workplace, I don't think I would have predicted that I'd be having this type of conversation today. I think I would have expected that we would have solved it by now. And I think there are some places where people's experience is, yes, we have fixed this and that. And it means that everyone's in different places, and it means there isn't a consensus about what we should do next. So when you're working around this, different people want to go to different places. And one of the biggest roles we have is in trying to draw things together and agree what we're going to focus on. Because all of those viewpoints are valid and all of those viewpoints are true. But it's reflective of how our progress around gender equality has not been even. And intersectionality plays a really important point in that. We have solved certain things for certain groups in a really effective way, and we have not solved things at all for other people with different circumstances. And if I look at what we're trying to do, I think that question about intersectionality is a really big piece of what we will look at going forward, is how do we knit things together? Because we currently report on both gender and ethnicity. At the moment, you're not required to report on your ethnicity pay gap, for example, but there's no requirement to overlay those. But for example, no systems naturally overlay those, or our approach to data doesn't naturally overlay those. And that's historically where we've come from, but it feels like that can't be part of our future. So what are we doing in PwC specifically? We have absolutely not cracked this, and we're very much on a journey, but we do have the benefit of the fact that Sarah Churchman, who leads the team that I sit in, has been working in this for 16 years, which is a long time for in somewhere like PwC. And that does give us the benefit of having tried a lot of things, some of which have really worked and some of which have worked less. And I think it has enabled us to work out perhaps what works well for us and our organisation. One of the things that, for example, you won't see in our in the things that we do is a women's leadership programme now. We have done them in the past, but what we have found is they only focus on one strand, so you ignore all sorts of other strands, but also critically they don't shift the culture. In some ways, when I look at it, it sort of says, well, if you fix the women, you'll fix everything, but there was nothing wrong with the women in the first place, is the way. So I think focusing on building an inclusive culture is far more powerful, and our experience suggests it's much more effective at making change. And the other thing about it is that if you focus on building an inclusive culture, you're not just focusing on women, you're focusing on anyone who might find that their views are or their progression is inhibited. So what we really focus on a lot is the sort of structural and systemic and cultural barriers to women and other people moving through our workforce. And that is one of the biggest things that impacts many organisations' gender pay gap, is the lack of representation of women at senior levels or in senior roles, and we're not immune to that. So how are we doing? So as I said, we've started publishing our gender pay gap actually before we were required to, and at the moment our mean gender pay gap is 12.2%. But it's also worth saying that we're very conscious that gender pay reporting won't solve the problem. It's a very blunt instrument in that way, and there are multiple things that feed into it. We know that there are challenges for where we don't have enough women and girls entering particular industries. And we've done a lot of work in particular in the technology sector with a programme called Women in Tech to try and start, even before women and girls are applying to jobs and looking at the workplace, but actually in education, saying, please can you consider STEM subjects? Because we did some work quite a while ago now where we talked to people, and only 3% of girls were saying that they would consider a STEM career, and that's a really, really tiny amount. Now, it plays into things like our gender pay gap, but it also plays into a lot of other things. So our work on the Tech She Can Charter is actually looking at trying to drive that. It's also, if you just look at ethnicity pay gap reporting, the other thing is, the question is, what are you doing with it? Once you identify you have a gap, what are you doing to change that? So what we publish externally is the five-point action plan that we have, that we believe will change and improve our gender pay gap. And as I mentioned, we also publish our ethnicity pay gap. So this is what it looks like for us. And I think you probably can see there's a real link between what we say more broadly and what we say for ourselves. So the number one piece for us is the tone from the top correct? Because actually, if your leaders are not fully bought into this and don't talk about it authentically, it really won't change anything. And the way we have done that is we have set targets across our organisation for both gender and ethnicity, and we talk to our leadership on a quarterly basis about on their progress against those targets. Those targets were set for 2020. And in 2020, we will look at the progress that we still need to make and do an exercise where we look at the targets for the future. One of the things that plays into it for us is actually what pieces of work people get to be involved in. Lots of the work that happens at PwC is project-based, so it's really important that people get equal access to the biggest, most prestigious, most exciting jobs as part of that. Because if you don't do that, then you start very early creating barriers that limit people's progression and recognition. So we have a lot of a focus on ensuring that we have fair allocation of work opportunities across our organisation, and that's something else we monitor. We've done a lot of work around focused recruitment, ensuring that we're targeting a range of groups, and we're also making our recruitment available in different sources in different places. So you might not think about applying to PwC. Let's put this in place where you might see PwC, but also let's make sure that we tell people about what we're like as an organisation. And we are paying a lot of attention to our pipeline. So we look at, for example, who is in what we call Pathway to Partner, which is an extended process where you look at people who we think will be the partners of the future. And every year we look at the diversity makeup of that. And it gives us an opportunity to ask questions. I think that's the biggest thing, is that it isn't necessarily right or wrong, but it's just an opportunity to challenge and say, can we be really sure that we made all those choices for the right reasons? And that we didn't allow unconscious bias to play into it, for example. And the last thing is that we have a big investment in our returnship programme called Back to Business. All of things like Back to Business, and this is true of a lot of our activity, is very rarely targeted at women. It's open to everyone. But we know that there are lots of things that we do that are appreciated by women more because of circumstances that they're in, or because women are more impacted by them, for example. Some of those types of things actually are things that we're doing right now. So we're doing some work around our approach to domestic and sexual violence. We're doing some work around with the Royal College of Gynaecologists around women's health. And it is published tomorrow. There is a large report from Investing in Women's Futures coming out, which is about things like the pension pay gap. The pension pay gap in the UK stands at nearly 40%. So it's a really significant issue, and what this research has identified is that there are critical decisions that women make over their lifetime that can have a really negative impact on their financial futures. So it's a really interesting piece of work, and one that I really recommend people look at. So here are some of the specifics that sit behind it. I've mentioned targets. One of my roles is that I run sessions on inclusive leadership, looking at what are the behaviours that our leaders need to demonstrate to include people. And I work with partners and senior leaders to help them understand unconscious bias and what unconscious biases they may have. We also really look at ethnicity and gender in our succession planning. So as we think about who will take leadership roles in the future, making sure that we have diverse shortlists for those. And that applies to recruitment too. We have made a commitment that we will not have all male shortlists. And so there are a number of conversations where we ask people to go back and say we need a broader pool of candidates before we make a decision. And we've really done a lot of work to raise the profile of some of our female partners and our partners from ethnic minorities as well, because our people have told us that the role models are absolutely critical. And that aligns with external data, but it's always helpful, I think, for us to go and also say, do we see this for real in our organisation too? And as I mentioned, a lot of work's been done with recruitment. They hold a massive key because if the people that you're bringing into your organisation aren't a diverse mix, you're really then going to struggle. So we monitor that very closely, and they've been a great supporter in helping us increase the diversity in amongst our people. And our teams who look after the projects are called our resourcing teams, and we've similarly worked really closely with them to enable them to do some of the work around challenging this. There are lots of reasons why someone might say, can I have this person again on my project? But if we do that repeatedly, we take away the opportunity for someone else to work on that big flagship client and similar, and our resourcing teams play a critical role in that. And our approach to diversity is embedded in our talent management approach. So we're just about to enter our performance year end, where everyone looks at how they've performed over the year. And by example, what we will do is in those meetings where we look at that, we will monitor how the distribution looks across our ratings in terms of both gender and ethnicity, and the same for the number of people we're promoting. So we really pay really close attention, because it's really hard to unpick decisions that have already been made. The critical thing that we need to do is to have the conversation at the time when it's happening. So those are the things that we're doing, and I think one of the things that I've learned is that inclusion and the steps that we need to take to balance for better are all positive acts. Inclusion doesn't happen passively. It doesn't happen by default, unfortunately. We're not at that stage, either for us as an organisation or indeed in broader society. So the challenge that we have put to our people this week has been, what are you going to do that would help us achieve parity faster? And I think it's a really valid one for us all to reflect on, because actually there are lots of small things that if lots of people did them would make an enormous difference. And for me, working in the cultural space, I think that 9 times out of 10, the cultural shift is achieved by the lots of small things rather than the big thing. So I suppose that's the question I would leave you with, is what are the things that maybe you can do that would help us achieve parity faster and deliver on balance for better? Thank you.
So I thought I'd start with a little anecdote of my first trip to University Council, which is like the big organising body in the university which legislates on basically everything. And luckily for me, it fell on my first day in the job. So throwing myself in at the deep end. And the first thing I noticed was that not a single woman spoke in that meeting for an hour and a half. And then when a woman did, it was me asking a stupid question about the university's finances that I probably should have known the answer to. I didn't speak for the rest of the meeting, and neither did any other woman. I tell you not because this was a one-off, but rather that has been something that has been symbolic of a wider environment that I found myself in time and time again since I've been in this job. I find myself consistently among a token handful of women in a room full of middle-aged white men. There is no balance of voices in this university. Women in leadership are rare and they're largely silent. They focus primarily in the administrative services, which means that they sit and write notes when the men are talking. But it's important that the voices that we hear and that we listen to are not just the women at the top and in leadership, but are also those from students and from staff as well. So today I want to talk to you about what it would mean to have a university that was balanced. So this wouldn't just require women in leadership or having more women in STEM subjects or more women in general in the university. It requires something much more radical, which is for us to reconsider what a truly balanced university would be, to reconsider what we value as leadership, what we value as good, what we think of as profitable and beneficial to society. So let's start with leadership. So I'd like to just take a moment to have a little think of a politician or a senior academic. Now, most of the people who are in this room are women, but no doubt many of you would have thought of someone who is old, white, and male. And that is the caricature and the model that we see time and time again. Now, many might say, why is this a problem? If they're the most skilled, most qualified, then surely they should be the ones to lead. But it does create a huge number of problems. This model of leadership values assertiveness and dominance, which has historically been associated with men. As Marla Hutton says, sexism in politics is a path-dependent process. Once men start to dominate in politics, then people begin to associate masculine characteristics with leadership, and the places that men socialise, like poker halls or dining halls, turn to sites of political negotiation, and formal areas of power, such as Congress, adapt to male desires. So what are the effects of this? There are three that I'd like to talk to you about today. The first is the isolation of those who don't fit the mould. Going to university council would have been intimidating enough for any 21-year-old, but without being so identifiably different to everyone else in the room. This discomfort has only been amplified by the fact that one of the first pieces of advice that I was ever given was that when I was in a university committee, I should only speak when I knew I had something really important to say, when I'd taken a moment, truly reflected, and knew that it was powerful and poignant. And it was something that stuck with me for a long time. In fact, it's something I've prided myself on for a couple of months of saying, I know that when I speak, people will listen because I know that I would have taken the time to think, and it's a powerful thing to say. But let me tell you, most of the people in that room do not take the time to stop and think before they talk. In fact, there are men in there that I must have collectively spent hours listening to, compared to me speaking for a couple of minutes. Why am I the one that is automatically assumed that I need to think about what I say before I speak? This has irrevocably pushed me into silence on numerous occasions. And yes, they might listen when I speak, but surely I should be able to speak whenever I want. And when I do, I should be able to speak freely and openly. One of my first meetings afterwards, it was about Prevent. I'm quite passionate about Prevent being racist and terrible, unsurprisingly. And afterwards, I was told that I was feisty. And I was like, that's a compliment. And then the more I thought about it, I was like, that's not a compliment. All I did was stand up for what I believed in. No other man in the room, well, they weren't really talking to be fair, but would have been told that they were feisty. They would have been commended for speaking their opinions and speaking it strongly. So either I am silent or I am feisty. But secondly, more than just the discomfort that I have experienced, there is the lack of respect you receive, which does have a tangible impact. I'll rewind now to almost a year ago. We're currently in election season to replace me. Don't forget to vote. But when I was running, I admittedly ran as the outsider candidate, who hadn't had as much experience in the Students' Union as other candidates. But what I had done was I'd been women's officer here, I'd run the College Feminist Society, in fact I founded it, I ran the College Politics Society, and I was also spearheaded the university's sexual consent campaign. I think you'd say I was relatively experienced. But that's not what the student press said. In fact, the night that I won, one of the editors was audibly heard on a microphone saying, the union's effed, and that anyone could do a better job than me. This was from a group of men that I'd never spoken to, never met, and let alone worked with. No other candidate in that position had their integrity or their competence questioned, but me, a woman whose experience had been entirely about feminism and feminist activism, was consistently questioned. Indeed, once they were called out for their bias, the student media replied, "These assertions may work to buoy campaigners, but they will not pass in the real world." So in the real world, I won't be allowed to declare that men have been sexist toward me when they have, because it doesn't pass in the real world. I think it tells you much of what I have to say, that is that the assumption consistently throughout my time here has been that I should be silent, that I've broken a mould, that I am either feisty or too incompetent to take on the job. I'd like to think that I've proved them wrong, but hey, some people can never be changed. But the third bit goes deeper than that. It goes deeper than just uncomfortability and difficulties for women who are in leadership. It means that the questions that we matter most to women don't get discussed. So this university talks the talk. We hear all the time it's going for Athena's Swan. It's got in its mission statement, it claims to make commitments to equality, and it reports on its gender pay gap. But as we were saying before, it reports on it. What does it tangibly do to challenge it? If we genuinely want to have discussions about these issues, we need women in the room discussing it. If we're talking about the gender pay gap, consistently I'm the most vocal person in the room saying the gender pay gap needs to be fixed, even though I'm not a staff member that's being paid. but because I'm a woman in the room, automatically it becomes my responsibility to fight those issues. But if the university actually wants to fight the gender pay gap, it should have supported staff during the UCU strikes, because disproportionately it was women that are in the lowest paid lecturing positions and most precarious contracts in this university. Instead, they all sat with the Vice-Chancellor with his £500,000 salary and did nothing. Or if we look at the gender attainment gap, we had a most recent report on it. I think it's about 15%. It's particularly high in humanities subjects. And they say they're committed to fixing it. But what they are also committed to is the conservativeness and the tradition of this university. The university loves supervisions. It's like the beacon of everything. They think that it's great. You have one-on-one supervisions, it's tailored, you get one-on-one time with a staff member. Sounds great. But what that doesn't take into account is the fact that women disproportionately do worse under this system. To sit in a supervision requires a lot of confidence. It requires a lot of articulation and a lot of ability to say what you think. And this goes into exam writing styles as well. So one of my worst exam in my entire degree was one where you got a question, you get 9 questions, and you have to just answer one question for 3 hours, and it can be on anything in politics. So like, there's a question, my question I answered was, why vote? I mean, it's the broadest question you've ever read, and there is so much you can say. And the key we're always told to in it is to be assertive. Just write what you think, write it with gusto, and you'll do well. Safe to say, I did not do well. And in fact, no, neither did any women I know. In fact, I know 2 people that got a first in that paper, and they were both men. That exam structure is inherently designed for men. The exam structure, the supervision structure, and the way we think in this university is still designed for men. So they can say they'll fix the gender attainment gap, but let me tell you, the university isn't getting rid of supervisions anytime soon. So it requires a much more radical overhaul of what we hold dear to in this university. What this requires is, in part, women in leadership. But I make this point with a number of caveats. Firstly, one woman cannot represent and discuss the issues that all women face. Women are an incredibly diverse group with an incredibly diverse set of opinions, and I cannot probably attest to the issues that so many of them face. Furthermore, it shouldn't be my responsibility. A man in my role could spend all his time talking about rent, and that would be fine. Why do I have to spend 20% of my time talking about X, Y, and Z that they wouldn't have to do? And furthermore, there's no guarantee that a woman in leadership will protect women. My favourite example from my degree was Blair's Babes of 1997, which was when basically a load of Labour MPs turned out to be female that year. Obviously, they were then babes rather than, legitimate politicians, but there we go. But fundamentally, everyone assumed that this was the beacon of feminism and that women would be much more empowered after this. However, it was under that leadership that lone parent benefit premiums were cut extensively, having a significant impact on a large number of women. And yet only 8 women voted against the cuts, because they voted in line with the party, because it wasn't their responsibility to deal with just the women's issues, and they shouldn't be the ones that are constantly belittled by their party for fighting against them. So there's a constant conflict that women face of being the feminist in the room, but also going with the order in order to elevate themselves. So it's no easy thing. But the chances of the issues being discussed are very low if there are no women in the room. There is also the symbolic value. Hopefully, I feel that being in a position of leadership this year, I have inspired even 1 or 2 women in this university that they can do the same. Challenging the norm is incredibly important, but it is only one part of it. I don't want to be the token woman in the room. I want to be surrounded by women who are also fighting for and able to make changes on a wide range of levels. Because it's only then that we can achieve substantive rather than surface level balance at the university. We don't need 2 vice-chancellors, one that's a man and one that's a woman. We need to empower the women at every single level to listen to their voices and question what we are valuing. Should we automatically be valuing the man at the top with a £500,000 salary and all he's doing, or should we be valuing the cleaners and the lecturing staff and all of that who are disproportionately women? We need to provide much more support for ground level movements like feminist societies and the Women's Liberation Campaign and the Students' Union. We need to give more value and credence to women in lower paid work, and we need women in middle management as well as women in leadership. The importance of this was highlighted to me by a report by Weldon into how much governments have responded to the issue of violence against women. They found no linear relationship between the proportion of women legislators and the government's responsiveness to violence against women. So, for example, the governments that had been super responsive to violence against women varied from 6.4% of women in the legislature to 21.2%. So clearly no direct correlation. There was a correlation though when there was women in leadership, but also a strong women's movement as well. It was only when both things happened simultaneously that genuine change about violence against women was able to happen. So my point is, achieving balance isn't about the Vice-Chancellor or about me. It's about questioning the value we put on power, about questioning the assumptions we make about what is valuable and what is normal. In terms of voices, it requires us to value the voices on every level of the university. We need to interrogate the notion that those at the top will always be the most knowledgeable or know best. Often I find that's very much not the case. We as a university need to put our money where our mouth is and provide proper support for women's movements. We must listen to them on an equal footing, and we must respect and value their voices. It's only then that we will generate policies which truly will create balance for better.
Jacqueline, Maya, and everybody, well, thank you very much. You've put in so much time and effort to organize this, and Maya as well. So let me begin by wishing everybody a very happy International Women's Week. Many more things to come. So in 1909, I mean, I'll take you to a different world, because we've been in the UK, we've been in Cambridge in the previous two talks. But just to remind ourselves, in 1909, some 110 years ago, the first National Women's Day was celebrated in the United States. And it was to honor garment women workers who were protesting in New York against their working conditions, something that you would empathize with. In fact, in those early decades, women across the globe were demanding equal rights with men on a whole range of issues. Of course, there was a right to vote, but there was a right to education, there was a right to stand for public office, right to decent work, and the right to property, among others. And India also, if you go back and think back to the 1920s and 30s, there was a whole women's movement, and these were also the issues that they were talking about. Now, of course, there's the National Women's Day has been a long way ago. In 1975, the United Nations declared 8th of March as the International Women's Day. And each year we come together in different parts of the globe to celebrate our gains, to celebrate our common causes across differences. And we also come together to take stock, as has happened just now, on how far we have come and how far we still have to go. So we seek equality not just with men, but also among women by class, race, and other diversity. So why is gender equality, as you've called it, gender balance, so important? Now, of course, we all agree the simplest thing is justice and fairness. That's the moral argument. But there are many other reasons. And in particular, we all know that the world will be less humane, less creative, less smart, and less productive without gender balance. In fact, if we take the challenges of climate change, without the involvement of women, would we even have a livable planet? Would we? Yes? No. So beyond justice and fairness, what difference does gender equality make? So what I'll do is I'll illustrate it with two kinds of examples that I worked on. One examines women's access to private property, the other women's access to common property. And I will indeed draw upon two of my books, initially and another work, A Field of One's Own, which was, as you can see by the title, inspired by Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, and the other, Gender and Green Governance. So let's first consider property and land. Now, when you ask people what defines women's economic status, the answer I usually get is, are they employed? What are they earning? What is the wage gap? But when you ask, well, what is a man's economic status? What would you say? What would you say? Wealth? Does he have property? Why is everybody so silent? I'm not asking you to think before you speak. So why do we make this distinction? And for very long, I believe what we've assumed is that women's class status is defined typically by the marital or their parental status. So if a woman is born into a rich household, or if she is married to a rich person, you'll assume that they are wealthy. Now, is that a fair assumption? I would say only partially, because daughters can always be disinherited and wives can be divorced, leaving them very vulnerable. In fact, in the UK, until 1882, as some of you would know, and it might come as a surprise to others, a married woman's property was controlled entirely by her husband under the law of curvature. She could not write a will, could not enter into a contract without her husband's consent. If she became a famous author, the copyrights would really belong to the husband, and all the royalties that came from that would go to him. So perhaps it was better to remain single. So in fact, interestingly, last November when I was going through the art galleries, I found this portrait of an heiress, and the explanation was very interesting, that she'd inherited all of this, she'd married somebody, and then she got her marriage annulled because he was frittering away all her wealth. So although it caused a scandal, she kept her fortune. So it's not until 1882 that the Married Women's Property Act gave women rights to own and control their own property in the UK. And I think it was a little bit before that in the US. Now today, of course, we know that British women, if you take total wealth, there have been some assessments of that, it's 43% of total wealth. But as on the pension gap, the gap is very big, as Evie just talked about. But among the very richest, hardly 8% of the very richest are women. In India also, until the early 20th century, barring some minority communities, women could not inherit ancestral property, except in the absence of 4 generations of men. Indeed, one of the first demands of the Indian women's movement in the 1930s was the right to land and property. And after India gained independence from colonial rule in 1947, women got full rights to vote, and legal reform gave them greater rights in property than before, but not equal to men's. So it was only in 2005, with the amendment of the Hindu inheritance law, Hindu women constitute 80% of India's population, they got full legal rights in property. And it was a result of a 9-month civil society campaign, of which I was also a part. But a serious gap still remained between legal rights and actual ownership, and between ownership and control, because of social norms. So why is it so important that women own property, and especially in developing countries, they own land? Now, this is where I was saying, let me take you to another world. I don't have images with me today, but many of you have traveled, you've been to Uganda and elsewhere. Now, most women in developing countries still work in agriculture, and few own land. So they face much higher risks of poverty, especially because of divorce or widowhood. So in South Asia, for instance, you can find widows who've been deprived of their property shares by family members, and often working as agricultural laborers on the fields of their brothers-in-law. In fact, without the ownership of property, a woman who's married into a rich household can become destitute. Equally, if a woman has even a small plot of land and she's poor, she can move out of poverty. Because imagine, if you have a small plot of land, it can make a big difference. Apart from building a small house or a homestead, you can grow vegetables, you can have fodder for animals, you can run a business. Then there are intergenerational benefits if women own property. So although we think of the family as the heart of the heartless world, in fact we know families are far from altruistic, and often what you find is that there are serious inequalities within families. Now, intergenerationally, what is very interesting is a whole body of work which built up in the 1990s and early 2000s, which showed that if the mother had assets, it would make a much bigger difference to the likelihood of children going to school, to their health, to them getting better health care than if the father alone had assets. And in fact, in Brazil, it was found that child survival probabilities were 20 times greater when asset income accrued to the mother than to the father. Also, owning property increases women's bargaining power. And so it's often in India you say, well, why do we need sons? We need sons because sons look after parents in old age. But consider, when I went to the villages, I found you talk to elderly women, and if they had a little bit of property, they would typically say, well, it's important that I have it because without property, children don't look after parents well. Also, most importantly, and both of you, Evie and Rebecca, you touched on issues of violence. Owning immovable property can protect women from domestic violence. Now, internationally, we know that violence against women was one of the single most important catalysts of the second wave of the women's movement, which is, around the 70s. And in fact, 2002, there was a survey, and 180 countries listed this as the most vital gender concern. Globally, we know that women face violence, even in rich households. So some people argue, well, if a woman is employed, then she will be less subject to domestic violence. But we know that employed women also are subject to domestic violence. In fact, there are some studies which show that if you're employed, better employed than the husband, you might face greater violence. So what protects them? So a colleague and I actually did a study looking at different factors which affected spousal violence. And in particular, we looked at whether or not the woman owned immovable property like a land or house. So we looked at 500 randomly selected households in rural and urban households in Kerala, which is at the tip of India. It's supposed to be the most woman-friendly state. If you look at this, at the 100% literacy, women are educated, and so on. And yet this is what we found when we looked at the difference between propertyless and propertied women. The incidence of physical violence was 49% among women who owned neither house nor land, 49%. And guess what the incidence was if they owned both? Jacqueline?
I'm guessing it was higher.
It was 7%.
Oh, okay.
If they had property. Okay. So what we did was, of course, you'll say, well, there are many other factors which matter. So I did what economists do, which we control for a whole range of other factors like the education and employment status of the man and woman, alcohol abuse, the household's property status, childhood experience of violence. So after controlling for all that, we found this was the most important factor. So what does immovable property do? Well, women recognize it. It gives them an exit option. But not only that, the fact that there's deterrence to violence means that the man is less likely to be violent towards you, the spouse. And so, as one woman told us, my 10 cents of land have helped me to escape the nightmare because she had got beaten. The other said, if I lived in my own house, I could have told my violent spouse, you leave. Most importantly, so all these factors are extremely important, and of course it is very important in building women's self-confidence and sense of self-worth. And wherever you find that there have been movements to give women rights in property, for instance in China in the early part of the 20th century, and when women received rights to land in their own names, for the first time they said, we are going to be registered in our own names, not as somebody's wife or not as somebody's daughter. And in India, when in some villages, when women for the first time in the late 80s received land in their own names, this is one of my favorite quotes. So those who've heard it before, please excuse me. These women said, these are very poor rural women who said, we had tongues but could not speak, we had feet but could not walk. Now that we have the land, we have the strength to speak and walk. So all these are possibilities of individual gains. But then entire countries can gain because if you have gender balance and access to land. So you have millions of farmers in Asia Africa and Latin America who are women. Their numbers are growing because you're getting a feminization of agriculture. More men than women move out first into non-farm jobs. And so in Southeast Asia, 45 to 50% of the farmers, and in some countries more than 50% are women. Now, many of these women bear the major responsibilities of farming, but rather few of them have rights or they have rights, they may have legal rights, they don't have actual access. So in Nepal, for instance, only 14% of landowning households did women own land. In Kenya and Ghana, only 5 to 10% of registered landowners were women. Landowners were women. In Latin America, a little higher, 23 to 30%, if you take women who own land in their own names and as joint titles. But this isn't all, because what would you do with a piece of land if you didn't have anything to support it? You need irrigation, you need credit, you need fertilizers, you need access to markets. So all these are, you find there's a huge gender bias. So then what if? The what if question. What if there was gender balance? And here the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization did an assessment in 2011 to ask precisely this question. If we bridge the gender gap in access to inputs, to land and to credit, they assessed it would increase crop output by 20 to 30%. And agricultural growth in developing countries could rise by 2.5 to 4%, which is a huge increase. So not only would gender equality in access to land and property reduce women's risk of poverty, it would improve the health and nutrition of children, reduce domestic violence, and enhance family food security and the country's food security. Indeed, it would help us achieve many of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. You've heard of the Sustainable Development Goals? Yes. Okay. So this is my part of the story relating to private property. But then there's also common property. What is common property? What do you see as the commons? Anybody? Land collectively shared. What else? Do we have a commons in Cambridge? Yes? We have a commons in Cambridge, right? We have a commons in Boston, right? Forests are commons, water bodies are commons. So access to these constitute huge amounts of property. They're public property, held in common trust in a variety of ways. So I'm going to talk a little bit about forests as commons. We know that forests are essential for mitigating climate change. They are key sources for sequestering carbon and for biodiversity. But what is less well known, perhaps, is that forests are necessary for the livelihoods of millions of people in developing countries. So a group of us did this report, including some colleagues from Cambridge, on forests and food. And we found that 1 in 6 persons globally depend on forests for supplementary food, for fuel, for fiber, for fodder, for fruits, for fertilizers. Well, you can add fruit, that will make the 6th F. So most of these are gathered by women and children. And this is not very different if you look at, say, 18th century England. So if you look at the work of economic historian Jane Humphreys, she describes what women used to get from forests. And if you look at some of the images and drawings of that period, you will see what she's describing. Women used forests for gathering fuel wood, bringing huge loads, bent nearly double. So they would be like this, or they would stand near the wall like this just to rest for a bit. They gathered also watercress, rabbits, pigeons, raspberries, hazelnuts, herbs, and so on. But the enclosure movement excluded them. So this is a part of history which is less talked about of the enclosure, that most women protested the enclosures, but they had rather little means of influencing the decisions, the sort of thing that Evie was talking about. And they had little say in the man-made rules of accessing the commons. So this is the second major issue of gender balance, namely across access to commons such as forests. Who decides the rules of forest use? So to understand this, in 1988 and 99, I traveled across India and Nepal for 6 months, across 7 states of India and parts of Nepal, to answer this question. And I basically went to villages, I talked to villagers to see what they were doing. And I found, firstly, which is a good thing, that thousands of communities were protecting their forests. In India in 2001, there were 84,000 community forestry groups covering 22.4% of forest land. Now that's quite a lot of land, it's a quarter of forest land. And that's, you'll say, quite rightly, is a very good thing. But everywhere women complained that they had been excluded from accessing the forests on which they depended for their daily needs. So you'll ask, well, what does inclusion mean? So basically what happens in a community forestry group, if a community starts protecting, I'll call them CFGs for short, is that you have a 2-tier governance structure. So you have a general body with members from the whole village and an executive committee of something like 9 to 15 persons. It's a very standard form of governance structure that you'll find in most institutions. Now both these bodies interactively made the rules of forest use, the forms of protection, benefit distribution, and conflict resolution. The core decision-making body was, of course, the executive committee, not unlike academic institutions. Now, what does forest protection involve? Basically involves restricting entry of people and animals and regulating extraction. So you say, well, you can extract fodder, but only for 1 day a week. Maybe you can extract firewood or not, timber or not, and so on. So if the EC, the executive committee, bans the collection of firewood, as it did in many cases, poor rural women would face intense hardship, because where would they go for collecting firewood? They had no land of their own, and they couldn't go to the commons, no private property, no access to the commons. Where would you go to collect firewood, which was their responsibility for cooking the evening meal? So what would you do? How would you influence the executive committee? Well, first of all, you have to be a member of the executive committee. But you can be a token member, and that's not enough. You need to attend meetings, you need to speak up at them, and you need to be able to influence the decisions in your favor. In fact, that is the case in any collective. I found that typically women were not even nominal members of ECs. Some ECs had no women, others had 1 to 2 women. The 1 to 2 women rule came in because it was felt that 1 woman would feel lonely. So they brought in, 1 to 2 women. Now 1 to 2 women in 11 to 15 men are seldom effective. Also because if you're talking about South Asia, you have traditional social norms, so many did not attend meetings. Those who attended rarely spoke up. If they spoke, their opinions were given little weight. I call these participatory exclusions as a term. But actually, if you look at Parliament, not so long ago, a century ago, maybe in Britain and elsewhere, there were all kinds of ways by which social norms excluded women. Not just not to be able to stand for office, but simple things like bathrooms, on which floor were they? When were the meetings held? Were they held at timings where women had to be with kids and so on? So. But despite this, what I also found was that there were some groups where they have had mixed gender groups which had 30 to 40% women, and some were all women's groups. So this raised a lot of questions in my mind. Would women's inclusion really affect decisions on forest use? Would it lead to better conserved forests? Would women's class matter? We talk about intersectionality. How many women would make an impact? There's this whole question. This whole set of questions are fundamental and foundational for effective environmental governance. So what I did was, after all these travels, and I'd written a bunch of articles and so on, I decided, let me study this more systematically. And I did a primary survey in Gujarat, in Western India, and in 3 districts of Nepal. And I wanted to test whether the gender composition of the executive committee would make a difference to women's effective participation, rule making, forest condition, and equity in sharing forest produce. So the first thing I tested was, do we need a critical mass of women? Is there such a thing, a minimum proportion of women for them to be effective? And the basic idea is that the presence of other women will help individual women overcome social restrictions and personal reticence. What I found was that the likelihood of women attending meetings, speaking up, and holding office was significantly higher when the EC had at least 25 to 33% women. So it constituted a critical mass. Now, this idea of 1/3 came up in Scandinavian parliament many years ago. A sociologist in the 80s had written about it. It was on the basis of a general observation, but not actually testing it. So when I went into testing it, I started as a skeptic. I said, what is this magic number? So that's very interesting that in fact 25 to 33% came out as the number. Also interestingly, I found that committees which had more poor women, in fact, attended to, if you have a critical mass of poor women, they were much more outspoken than well-off women. Why? Because they had less to lose in terms of social status, and they had a great deal to gain if the decision went in their favor. But this was not all, because we want women to participate, but as was said earlier, we also want them to have results. So what were the results? So I said, well, let me test whether, if there's a critical mass of women, does it make a difference to conservation outcomes? And here's what I found. And I controlled again for a range of other factors which could affect forest conservation outcomes, population size, forest size, landlessness, and so on. I found in the case of Nepal that there was a 51% greater probability of improvement in forest canopy in groups, all women groups, compared to groups with men. It's a huge difference. This was despite the fact that all women groups receive more degraded and smaller forests. Similarly, in Gujarat, in India, mixed gender groups with more than 2 women had better outcomes than groups with 2 women or less. Again, groups with more poor women did substantially better. So essentially what we're talking about is the sort of results which you hope to get, but you don't always get, which is really a win-win. The win-win is that better conservation, more equal benefit sharing by class and gender. Now, why do groups with more women do better? Why do you think they did better? Why do you think? Yes? They can back each other up, but in terms of forest improvement, yes, they back each other. Absolutely. What happens then in terms of forest improvement? So here's, I'll share with you. Firstly, it improves protection because, for a start, if 50% of the population is hostile and 50% make the rules, obviously the hostile population is going to try and break the rules, especially for something as important as firewood and grass. So here's what they said, that the women in Nepal said. We feel the forest is ours now. Earlier, I used to steal grass from the forest, but after becoming an EC member, I have stopped stealing. If you bring people in to make the rules, they're less likely to break the rules. It's a simple rule of thumb that we need to remember. Also, they could spread information about rules to other women and persuade them to comply. So, you have women's networks, especially with social norms. You have all women's networks, all men's networks, and they could persuade other village women to follow the rules. So they would say, often village women would cut firewood from the protected forest in times of need. We held a meeting and they stopped cutting. We also decided to patrol the forest every day. And then the third is that they have, knowledge about forest use is not taught in classrooms necessarily, unless you've gone to a biology class. And, these are women who gain their knowledge from actual, going into the forest and learning from it. And so you have differences in knowledge systems between men's knowledge and women's knowledge. So it added to the knowledge pool, and they had particular knowledge of forest products, which species to plant, how to extract, and so on. And in addition, apart from conservation, women being on the EC could persuade male EC members to allow greater extraction of firewood and other products without harming the forest. So whether we are dealing with private property resources or common property resources, gender equality can bring gains not just to the women, but also to the community and to the country. and the latter by increasing food security, by improving forest conservation in these examples, and so mitigating climate change. But who will fight for gender balance in economic resources, or better representation of women in public institutions, or for any other matter? Who do you think? All of us here today, all of us globally, we need to come together, not just in terms of women, but I think all gender progressive people, including men. I'm glad we have some in our audience, to ensure gender balance in our field. Rather, at the moment, it's a bit unbalanced, I must say. We have only two men. I hope they're not feeling lonely. Anyway, I'm very happy you are here. But I think it's extremely important when we talk of gender balance that when we're speaking about gender issues, that men participate. I always think of this line by poet Shelley when there's one of his poems which says, "Can man be free if woman be a slave?" Which is very true. So the project for gender equality must be claimed as our own by both sexes. I think that's one big lesson that we have. So I'll end with sharing with you some words of a song on International Women's Day. There's a feminist activist and friend of mine, Kamla Bhasin, who wrote this song 2 decades ago. So I'll translate 2 lines for you in English. It says, "Breaking their shackles, our sisters come. Look, O you people, our sisters come. They will come, they will fight oppression, they will build a new world." Thank you.